have you noticed that politicians struggle to enact the things they run on? That regardless of who wins elections, lawmakers find they cannot pass whatever legislation they like. They find themselves bound by what is popular, or at least their sense of it. They can only act within a narrow set of ideas, and that range is called the Overton Window. And on the Overton Window podcast, we look at issues around the country and talk to the people who change what is politically possible. Now, a lot of foundational economists have argued that economic liberty is the special sauce that drives widespread prosperity. And make people secure in their property rights, let them figure things out for themselves, and they engage in mutually beneficial trade that makes everyone better off. Now, Bob Lawson is part of a project that attempts to take the next step by measuring economic liberty and seeing what its effects are on countries around the world. Bob is the director of the Bridgewell Institute at SMU Cox, and I want to talk to him about what he's found and whether this will shift the Overton window. Bob, welcome.
James, thank you for having me.
What is the Economic Freedom of the World Index?
So, like you said in your intro, we've been debating for a very long time about how we should organize our economic system. And some people, starting with Adam Smith and going on through the ages, really, John Stuart Mill, in the more recent century, people like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, we've argued that the system of natural liberty, which was Adam Smith's phrase, is a good way to organize the system. But, the problem is we've been debating about it, and there are people who are on the other side of that debate, people like socialists, Karl Marx and others. And what we've lacked in this debate for the last 200 some years is empirical rigor. And so I, along with my co-authors, Jim Gortney, Walter Block, originally, we started working on a measurement of economic freedom, trying to put a number, a quantitative number on how closely countries are following the sort of economic freedom, economic liberty lessons that Adam Smith taught in The Wealth of Nations. And so at the end of the day, we're just creating a yardstick so we can hopefully have a more informed conversation about, what works and what doesn't work out there.
What has been some of the challenges of defining that yardstick?
Well, freedom's a fuzzy concept. I mean, it's not as fuzzy as we see happiness indexes out there now. I think happiness is a lot fuzzier than freedom, but it's a fuzzy concept. So trying to find real data that exists. And for us, we set out with the goal of rating a large number of countries. Countries are our sort of unit of analysis. And we wanted to rate a large number of countries. And that means we're talking like Congo, Pakistan, Sierra Leone, Myanmar. And we knew from the get-go that we were going to, we're dealing with real world data. We knew from the get-go that we were going to have to make some compromises. The data that we get for these countries is ugly, it's messy, it's polluted by, all kinds of problems. And so we set out to create at least initially, a fairly simple index that measured the key elements of economic freedom. But the biggest challenges are data problems. I mean, we know what economic freedom is roughly from having read Smith and Hayek, but putting actual real world data together that reflects that freedom, underlying freedom, is the hard challenge.
Can you give me an example of some of the messiness involved in that?
Yeah, some of the things are relatively easy. I mean, we think governments that spend a lot of money, that tax and spend, are violating people's economic freedom. And that's relatively easy to measure. The World Bank and the IMF do a reasonably good job of collecting, even from the Congos of the world, collecting government spending data. But we also think property rights are critical for economic freedom. And how do you measure the security of property rights? And for a long time, for actually the first almost decade of the project, we struggled to find anything that reflected property rights. But now what we have is surveys. So we have a few cross-country surveys. The World Economic Forum does one. The Economist Intelligence Unit has another survey type product. And they kind of just ask people, like, hey, in your country, how impartial are the judges? In your country, how secure do you feel about your property rights? And we use those surveys to get us a feel for that. But surveys are messy, right? Surveys are surveys. And economists like me, at least my training was always like hard data is better than surveys. So one of the things we have to do with the index is kind of compromise on there's no hard number. It's not like inflation or tax rates. Things like regulations and property rights, especially, are fuzzier, and we're going to end up using survey-like products to get at them.
Hmm. And you guys have been doing this for well over a decade, I think approaching 2 now, right?
That's closer to 3.
Okay.
The very first proto index we ever
Right.
published came up with was 1992. So
Hmm.
3 decades. The first edition of the report came out in 96. So
Yeah.
we've been going, 2+ decades, all of
Excellent.
my career.
Yeah, so it's given you some time to try and refine it, respond to criticisms, try and find better ways of getting at the concept. So I guess the important question is, what is economic freedom associated with?
Well, at the end of the day, that was the goal, right? Once we have a rating system for economic freedom, and just to give you some context for the countries, historically, Hong Kong has always been the highest rated country. And we kind of knew that going in. If you saw Milton Friedman's Free to Choose video series back in the 80s, he celebrated Hong Kong's freedom. They don't have any tariffs. Their tax rates are really low. It's really almost as close to, Adam Smith's vision as any place on earth's ever gotten. And then at the bottom of the scale, we have countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and so forth. So we've got this scale that runs sort of from Hong Kong to Venezuela, and then what in 165 countries is our current set. The good news is that now we've got a number. It tells us, okay, Hong Kong is freer, Venezuela is the least free, the U.S. is 6th. I'm making numbers up now because I don't have them all memorized, but Ireland is 30th or whatever. And then we look for correlations, and like, oh my gosh, countries that are higher on our economic freedom scale have higher incomes, they grow faster, they invest more, they have lower infant mortality, less poverty. Pretty much every metric that we have of socioeconomic progress correlates in a way that economic freedom looks pretty good. Economic freedom correlates positively with good social outcomes. And that was, 30, 40 years ago, that was actually a debatable question. And now that we have the data in hand, it's really much less debatable. Very few people will challenge the basic notion that market-oriented countries that pursue economic freedom, will have better economic outcomes. They may have a yeah, but, or a complaint on some margin, but the big story, we've pretty much won. Having turned the debate into an empirical debate, we've kind of won the debate.
Hmm. But I mean, it's what you found is that countries with a lot of economic liberty tend to have better economic outcomes. But isn't that just a step short of what you really need, which is they have better outcomes because of economic liberty?
That's right. So, there's 2 issues. One is causality is always a challenge in social science. If A and B are correlated, doesn't necessarily mean A causes B. I mean, sometimes B causes A, and sometimes C causes both A and B. We have all these sort of, challenges with empirical work. But, I'm an academic, and I follow the academic literature pretty closely related to this index. And there are a number of good ways of handling, that. And those studies confirm the sort of more correlative studies. The second thing, and I think it related especially to the Overton window, which is a wonderful concept, by the way, is how do you get more economic freedom? Suppose it was the case that we all agree that economic freedom was a critical ingredient for social and economic progress. The next question is, well, how do you get it? How do you enact policies like that? And that's, of course, what the Overton window concept is about, is how you widen the window, or how do you get economic freedom ideas, things like lower taxes, more secure property rights, lower regulations. How do you get those things into that window so that we can get them enacted? And that's something that I have to be honest, I'm a little bit fuzzy on myself.
Well, we'll get into that, but before we cover that, I'm curious about one thing, which is, like, now that we've studied things, we're putting some numbers in it, we're trying to find its real world effects of this economic freedom concept. I mean, one of the benefits of the empirical revolution is that you find things that you didn't expect in the theory. So are there any bad outcomes associated with economic freedom?
So the only one that I think comes close, that really stands out in my mind, is there are 2 or 3 papers, and I wrote a counter paper, so I don't think this is settled. But the one that I've seen is obesity. It's a real thing. In the United States, obesity is a serious. Some people call it a public health. It's really a personal health problem, but it's a serious personal health problem for millions of Americans. Diabetes and heart disease, stroke, and so forth that is associated with obesity, and it's becoming a bigger problem in the rest of the world. If you look at just correlations, countries that have more economic freedom, well, we know they get richer. Mm-hmm. One of the sort of unfortunate consequences of people when they get rich is they eat more. So obesity is kind of one of the few sort of negative things out there that I think that's out there. The other one is highly debatable, but the one you'll hear is inequality.
Mm. So I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, the common claim is that economic freedom delivers the sort of economic goods. Market-oriented countries grow faster, get higher incomes, but the but economic inequality explodes. Most of the gains go to the rich and less goes to the poor, or something along those lines. That turns out, and we have now several dozen peer-reviewed academic papers. Now, this is not just a small literature. We have a pretty good-sized literature, and it turns out there really isn't a lot of strong evidence one way or the other on whether economic freedom causes more inequality. There's some studies that say it does, some studies that say it doesn't. The sort of average study gets like no effect, null effect. So there, I think what the challenge for us now is how do we percolate that research finding to like the general, population, the general audiences out there, because I think a lot of people think economic freedom has a negative in terms of inequality, when the research that we've got, and again, quite a lot of research now, doesn't back that viewpoint up.
What's going on there? Because you would think that like allowing people to be billionaires, which is not a thing that most places do, would obviously improve or like mean greater income inequality.
Yeah, well, in the limit, that might be the case. And there may be some cases where, I imagine North Korea, for example, there are some very rich people there, but most people are pretty equal to each other, equally poor. And so that's one way to achieve equality. But, the places that interfere with economic freedom the most, the places that tax, regulate, tariff the most, the people that have the sort of cronyist type economic systems where the judges are, corrupt and bribery is endemic and so forth. These places have elites within them that have gamed the system, and they turn out to be just as elite oriented. The 1%ers in Venezuela, which is the lowest country, are really quite well off relative to the 99%ers in Venezuela. If you look at the real world we're in, sure, some countries like the United States have a fairly high degree of inequality, but countries at the bottom of the scale like Venezuela have a equally high degree of inequality, despite their rhetoric of being socialist and all the socialist rhetoric that you hear from Venezuelan, the Venezuelan government. Despite that rhetoric, Venezuela is extraordinarily unequal in its economic system. So. Some of the countries that are most celebrated for their equality, the countries like the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark especially, are celebrated for their socioeconomic equality. Well, it turns out they're pretty high on our index. Denmark's, I think, in the top 10. Sweden is, top 30. Again, out of 165, they're much closer to the sort of U.S. and Hong Kong system than they are to the Venezuelan system. So again, when you look at the real data, it's far from obvious that economic freedom, brings along with it a lot of inequality.
Now, the policy conclusions that you've got seem to be pretty clear. It's like you're measuring economic freedom. You've got some things that are in that index. If you want to do better, you can improve some of those things. So, like protecting the integrity of your legal system, which turns out to be really complicated in some places, but other things like or do less of other things like increasing their regulatory burden on imports and exports. Do you think that, or have you seen people use your index to argue for more economic freedom?
Yes, I mean, obviously academics do it, but in the more policy realm, sort of the realm that the Mackinac Institute
Yeah.
runs through in, we do see some, uses of the index in this direction. The country of Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, explicitly references the Economic Freedom of the World Index at the ministerial level. It's a ministerial goal to go up in the index.
Hmm.
And they have actually. The Georgian government, especially in the previous government, even the current government, has really improved. Georgia's in the top 20 in the index now. Again, that's pretty impressive when it was a socialist country as late as 1991, right? So, so the government of Georgia, it's a small country, but they've explicitly used it. In other countries, for example, in South Africa, which is not a small country, the ANC, which is a left wing, nominally a socialist ruling party, the ANC will routinely call our partners there and ask, "Hey, if we pass this legislation, what's going to happen to the index?"
Hmm.
And the answer is almost always bad, like the index is going to go down because the ANC's policies are really pretty terrible. But it does show that even like socialist ruling parties like the ANC in South Africa, they're actually paying attention to the index. Obviously, the Hong Kong government pays attention. They're number one. Well, I should say they were number one. By the time your listeners hear this, we will have released a new report, and Hong Kong will have fallen to second place, and Singapore will be the number one country, and that'll be the first time. But the Hong Kong government has also celebrated the Economic Freedom Index and their number one position. They're going to be mad, I think, when they find out that they're no longer number one. The data are the data, though, and the data we use have caused them to fall in the ranking just a spot.
What did Georgia do to
Yeah,
improve
so
their rankings?
in the first 10 years of independence from the Soviet Union, Georgia fought civil wars and it was pretty much a disaster. But in the middle part of the 2000s, around 2004 or 5, a very pro-Western government took over. The president's name was Saakashvili. He's sort of a Columbia-educated lawyer. He wore Italian suits, spoke good English, and he really ushered in a series of liberal, or you might even call them libertarian reforms. And they drastically reduced taxes. The old Soviet tax system that the Georgians inherited was extraordinarily high taxes and complicated. And they lowered taxes to an across now the current it's an across the board 20% tax. That includes the VAT. So everything is 20%. It's very flat and pretty low. They have almost no tariffs on imports into the country. They opened up their country to travel, even. They don't have visas, including for Russians, somewhat controversially, even today. So Georgia really, really moved a long, long way towards economic freedom under that government. The new government, which is less ideologically friendly to economic freedom, hasn't done much to undo those policies, though, and that's the good news. The previous regime, the policy stuck, at least so far, in Georgia. So I've written several papers about Georgia. I can go on, but in the interest of time, I will save you the pain.
Well, no, I think that's very
Uh,
interesting,
yeah,
especially because every country is different. Everyone's responding to the own
yeah,
political incentives in the systems that they have. The
yeah.
structures are very different, but I think the index that you're using is really clever to encourage competition because no one wants to be left behind, especially for something where this is associated with broader prosperity. Every politician wants to bring prosperity to their country, and this is something that they can point to indicate some improvement. I mean, that just by itself is structured to try to encourage some better policies for these governments. Um,
That's right. I mean, one of the as a scholar, I'm actually less interested in the rankings, like who's number 2 or 4. I'm
yeah,
interested actually in the ratings, the actual numbers.
yeah.
But politicians and journalists, the rankings drive everything because if you go down, like your score could go up, but your ranking could fall if other countries have grown faster. And that turns out to be, like you say, a very motivational force for politicians who want to be able to say, "Hey, we went up in a ranking." So it's a wonderful political device in that regard, and it really wasn't our intention to make it one like that, but that's just the way it works out.
Well, that actually brings up a really interesting point that I wanted to ask you about, which is you're interested in the ratings, which means that it's not everyone's not standing in place or competing over just the number one spot. Is the world getting more economically free over time?
Yeah. Yes. According to our data, yes, unambiguously so. And I know that kind of runs against
unambiguously so.
Yeah. I mean, well, pretty much. And I know that runs a counter to the sort of the general malaise and pessimism that we always seem to have at any point in time. But the fact of the matter is, if you think about the index goes back to 1970 in terms of its scoring. If you think about the era of 1970, I mean, the early 70s, we had wage and price controls in the United States. We had borderline hyperinflation in the United. This is the United States. Right? Imagine what it's like in the rest of the world. We had tariff rates that were an order of magnitude higher than they are today. So tariffs have come down across the globe. We had military conscription in the early 70s, and lots of countries did. And that's a major violation of people's economic freedom. When the government says you have to work for us, you can't take the job you wanted to take. You have to work for us. So we had conscription, we had hyperinflation, we had much higher tariffs. Government spending was actually in many countries higher. Now it's actually the U.S. We've gone up in spending, but as a group, it's almost every country's gone up in the index in a rating sense. The only countries that have gone down are like 4 or 5 at the bottom, like the Venezuela's. And Venezuela's is tragic. I mean, Venezuela was in the top 20 in 1970, and now it's dead last. 165 out of 165. But it really stands out as the exception. Almost every country's gone up. Even Africa. I mean, African socialist, most of the countries in Africa after they became independent from their colonial rule, they went socialist. And the ratings were terrible. I mean, on a 10-point scale, they were 2 and 3 and 4, really, really low. And now they're 4 and 5 and 6, which isn't great, but a 5 is much better than a 2. So we've seen a huge improvement, and it's slowed down in the last, say, 10 or 15 years. The rate of increase in economic freedom in our scoring has slowed down, but it's still positive. We're still seeing an upward trend on the average around the world.
I think that is incredibly surprising to a lot of people. I mean, for one, a lot of politics and news tends to be dour in general. But this idea that, for one, I think a lot of people don't recognize that the world is, in fact, becoming more prosperous. And I think from the work that you're doing, it's like a lot of that can be attributed to increases in economic liberty. So what's going on? Why is the world becoming more free?
That's a really good question. I don't have a strong answer. I mean, I'm a professor. I'd like to say, well, they listen to our lectures. I don't know that like our lectures or this book, but the reforms in China are, I think, instructive. When Deng Xiaoping began the reforms after Mao died, and Deng Xiaoping in 1978, what was his line? His line was, "I don't care." I don't care whether the cat's a socialist. I just care if the cat can hunt. Like we entered a period in the 80s and 90s of pragmatism in government and ideological rigor, especially on the left. The hard, like Mao's China transformed into Deng Xiaoping's Chinese juggernaut. And that was done because they liberalized the economy. They opened up the economy to private enterprise. They opened themselves up to global trade. And China's rating isn't very good in our index, but it's 100 times better than it would have been under Mao's time. And so it was a pragmatic approach by lots of governments. That's frustrating to someone like me who's an advocate for economic freedom, because pragmatists are only going to take that economic freedom so far. But that was the era we were in, and I think we've seen a little bit of a slowdown there. I think we're seeing a bit of a return to ideology in governance now. We're seeing more ideological type talk, whether it's the populist right, or the populist left. But the 80s and 90s, it was Clinton and Thatcher. It was Clinton. It was Tony Blair. It was just white lab coats, just trying to figure out what works, and taking out the ideology, the left's ideology especially. opened that window to things like, cutting taxes in the WTO and reducing privatization and things like that. Again, I think it's kind of coming to a close now, but it's still a little bit out there.
Although I think it's interesting that you point at ideology is one of the reasons why progress in greater economic freedom may be slowing, because there is an ideology that supports greater economic freedom too. But the beauty of your work is that it takes it beyond just that ideology, is saying that no, there are practical consequences from heading in this direction. We can be ideological about this, and I think people can do a better job of selling ideas. But there's some real practical effects here. And if you want better outcomes, this is the way you got to head.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely need theory. We need theory. We call it an ideology if you want. We need a set of ideas, and that's what ideology is. It's a set of ideas. So we need a set of ideas to guide us and how we think about things. Indeed, just collecting the data that we use in economic freedom required some set of ideas. It required an ideology about what economic freedom means. But once you have the numbers, it turns out to be very effective in disarming skeptics. If you've got a skeptic of economic freedom that you're talking to, if you just lead with an ideological discussion, you're wrong and here's my ideas are right, people get very defensive, they shut down. If you lead with, hey, here's these numbers, these egghead economists, in Dallas and Tallahassee, concocted, people are like, oh, there's some numbers. Well, what do the numbers mean? They slow down, and I think it takes away some of the defenses that they have if you lead with an ideological attack. And then, maybe after we look at the numbers, we can say, hey, why are these numbers? And that's where you go back to, the Hayek and the Friedman ideas. The reason economic freedom works, we think we know, and that comes from those ideas. But I like to lead with the numbers and then come back with the ideology. And a lot of people do it the reverse. And I think that doesn't work as effectively. At least it doesn't work as effectively for me.
Mm-hmm. What can the United States do better at?
A lot. So I should have mentioned, the U.S. is actually one of those exceptions. Now, we're still very highly rated. The most recent report that's going to come out is going to have the U.S. fifth. But the U.S. score actually topped out in the year 2000. So from 2000 to the present, and our most recent data will be 2021. We're always a couple years lagged. But so for the last 20 years, the U.S. has been declining in our economic freedom score. And so what's happened in the last 20 years, first and foremost, is there's been a fairly dramatic increase in the size of government in a tax and spend sense. First it was the war on terrorism, and then the actual wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was the financial crisis in the late 2000s, and then most recently, of course, COVID. All of that were excuses on the part of the U.S. government, state and local, to just dump money at problems. But it's also now becoming, we're seeing, maybe it's abating a little bit, but we saw a tick in inflation. And one of the areas we measure is monetary instability. And we've certainly seen some monetary instability lately. The U.S. is kind of become a laggard on international trade. As you probably know, neither political party right now is advocating for lower tariffs and more openness to global markets. I think both parties are soft on that at best and hostile at worst. And so the U.S. is now not looking that good in terms of free trade policies. And so we had a big movement towards freer trade under Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and even into H.W. Bush, or George Bush. And then it's kind of abated. So, trade policy's gotten worse, inflation's gotten worse, government spending's gotten worse. Even our property rate numbers have gotten worse. And that's a little bit harder and more concerning, probably. There's a worry, I think, on the part of a lot of people that our court system and our rule of law has weakened. And that's what we're seeing in the survey data that we use as well. So that's hard to fix, though, I got to say.
Now, well, to talk about these specific areas where the United States has been lagging. Now, it seems like fights over these specific sub-indices are rarely about overall prosperity or overall economic freedoms. I mean, minimum wage is part of the index. And the arguments about it are not, is this going to hinder
Yeah.
economic liberty? It is this going to lead to lower wages and loss of jobs for low-income workers? Should we actually care more about the effects and broader liberty?
Well, I think so. I think that one of the things we have learned from this index is that uh, how economic freedom is a bundle of policies. It's not one policy. It's not the absence of minimum wage. It's the absence of minimum wage. It's also tariff policy. It's also monetary policy and tax policy and so forth. And Jim Gortney, my co-author, and I frequently use a metaphor of a car. And if you ask people like, what's the most important ingredient in a car? Is it the steering wheel or the wheels or the brakes? Well, I mean, they're all important. If you take away any one of those ingredients, the car's either not going to work at all or it's going to be extraordinarily dangerous. And I feel the same way about economic freedom. Tax policy is important. And if you mess it up, you will really mess up an economy. Monetary policy is really important. If you mess it up, you can keep everything else perfect. And, so I think that one of the values of the index is it does give us a little bit of a step back position where we step back from the particular policies and kind of look at the whole set of policies. And it's not, you can mess up, you can mess up one of them a little bit. If your air pressure is a little low on your tire, your car's still going to work. But, so you can have a minimum wage, but if you set your minimum wage at $50 an hour, that's going to be a problem. All right. So no country gets a perfect 10 on our score. But countries that get 8s, 9s kind of across the board, they end up doing really well. And it's the countries that get, 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s. Those are the ones that struggle. So you can debate the individual particular pieces, and people do, and then policymakers, obviously do. We have the luxury as academics of standing back and saying, hey, let's look at the big picture here. Countries that get most of these policies right do really well. And so the key is to get most of the policies right, And what the U.S. has done, if you ask to the U.S., what the U.S. has done the last 20 years really is to move most of the policies in the wrong direction.
So I wanted to do just a little bit of summary over this project, which is we developed an index to tried really hard to measure economic liberty. We think it's really important. We put this out. People found that it really is associated with broad-based good economic outcomes. If you have economic liberty, you tend to have a place that does better off, not just for the wealthy or the elite people, but for everyone. There may be a link with obesity, though, for reasons that you specified. That in crafting this thing, you found that it actually has gotten attention. Like, this could have been something that had been completely ignored. It's like, oh, that's a nice index, but we really don't care. But in fact, some places have really taken this seriously. And you've cited just 3 examples of Hong Kong, Georgia, and South Africa. And some other places, because I pay attention to this. I want the United States to do better off on this index. And so that is something I actually want you to reflect on the work that you've done. Like, that seems like it's surprising and encouraging for you. Oh, and the other surprising and encouraging thing, the world is actually better off and people are more free than they used to be. So can you reflect on some of on your work on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, certainly all of that is gratifying me, especially the last part. I mean, we've lived through a wonderful period, the last 20, 30, 40 years of worldwide global poverty reduction. Literally, with a B, billions of people are now living dignified, lives, material lives that otherwise weren't in the older days. I got to say that more narrowly, though, the thing that brings me the most gratification is the scholarly impact. I'm an academic, I work at a university. What really kind of makes me happy is when other academics use our work, and we've penetrated the academic market quite nicely as well. We have quite literally thousands upon thousands of academic citations. And I realize that a lot of people kind of think academics are, we're writing papers and no one reads them and so forth. But if you get thousands and thousands and thousands of papers written with your data, you are actually affecting the scholarly climate of opinion. And the scholarly climate opinion does actually filter down. We're teaching students, we're teaching the next generation of congressmen and senators and presidents and and that climate of ideas really matters. And I think this index has played a role in improving that climate. It's a longer game, though. It's much more long game than, say, policy debates.